Hi, and welcome back to IRL, International Relations Literally. I'm Anna Gill, and today we're asking why race and gender aren't side notes in global politics. They're the lens that makes everything else make sense. We hear about war, treaties, and trade, but who fights? Who profits? Who's left behind? That's not random. It's patterned. And race and gender are at the core. To make that case, I'm drawing on Milner's critique of anarchy, Lake's methodological bets, constructivism, and critical theory. These theories don't just explain IR, they reveal what it often ignores. Now, let's dive into why race and gender matters most in international relations. Let's break it down. Mainstream IR theories, realism, liberalism, constructivism, present themselves as neutral, but they often ignore the lived experiences of those who aren't white, male, or Western. Race and gender aren't just add-ons. They reveal who international relations really serves. As Laura Schoberg and Cameron Thies write, gender must be understood as everywhere, across institutions, processes, and actors in the global political economy. It's not just about including women. It's about recognizing how power, violence, and policy are already gendered. Schoberg makes this especially clear in security. Gender is necessary for understanding international security, shaping how we analyze, predict, and respond to threats. Gender already defines who is seen as secure and who isn't. The same applies to race. Bianca Freeman, D.G. Kim, and David A. Lake argue that race is foundational to global order. Even as IR has stayed largely silent, this norm against noticing hides how race creates global hierarchies, defining who is legitimate, threatening, or even disposable. Race shapes who gets sanctioned, invaded, or heard. They remind us that international law was built not on neutrality, but on conquest, slavery, and exclusion, grounded in racial hierarchy. Race can help explain patterns of behavior, interstate interactions that sustain an unequal global system. So the question isn't whether race and gender belong in IR, it's how we can ignore them for this long. These aren't side issues, they're structural. They shape who gets protected, who gets policed, and who gets to define security itself. Now that we talked about how race and gender shape global politics, it's time to test the lens against IR's so-called core topics: war and peace, economic relations, law and agreements, class and nation, transnational challenges, empire and hegemony, and change. We're not saying race and gender are just one lens. We're saying they're the foundation. Let's start with war and peace. Traditionally, IR treats this like a game of chess between states. But where are the people in that? Where's the everyday violence? Even political scientist Jack S. Levy admits the theories of war and peace give little attention to constructivist or feminist approaches. And IR scholar Paul F. Deal critiques the concept of peace as not war for masking deep inequality. In other words, the field is obsessed with tanks and treaties and totally misses how conflict plays out in bodies, borders, and gendered silences. Race and gender don't just reveal more violence. They show us what peace hides. That's not optional insight. That's essential understanding. Then there's economics. Political economist Helen V. Milner says, trade reflects the preferences of the strongest groups in domestic politics. And scholar Michael Toms claims capital mobility increases economic efficiency. Let's unpack that. Who are those strongest groups? And who defines what counts as efficient? Race and gender scholars like Bianca Freeman, D.G. Kim, and David A. Lake remind us that global markets aren't just power-neutral playing fields. They were built on racialized hierarchies and colonial exploitation. States aren't equal actors. They're arranged in vertical relations of super and subordination. If you ignore race and gender, economic theory starts to sound like a rigged game, pretending to be fair. Let's talk about international law. On paper, it's all treaties, diplomacy, and justice. But peel back the language, and what you'll find isn't neutrality, it's hierarchy. Beth A. Simmons points out that for decades, international law was dismissed as irrelevant because it couldn't constrain actual power. And even now, she and John Odell both recognize that law mostly serves wealthy and dominant elites, where coercion and influence are present in virtually every encounter. But that's just theory. What about the view from inside the room? To unpack this, I'm joined by someone who's seen it up close, former diplomat Grant Justice, who spent years inside global negotiations where power and language collide. Thanks for being here, Grant.
Thanks, Anna. I remember one negotiation in particular. Western diplomats were pushing for what they called a universal safeguard. Sounds fair, right? But when a delegate from the global south asked how it would apply to his region, the response was basically, it won't. That's what universal really meant. The rules were written by the powerful for the powerful. Everybody else was just expected to sign on.
And there it is. That is why international law needs a race and gender lens. Because without it, IR keeps pretending law is neutral, when in reality, it's power in legal clothing. Law doesn't just reflect inequalities, it stabilizes them, and it gives them a stamp of legitimacy and calls it order. Next up, nationalism and class. Political scientists Harris Milonis and Maya Tudor argue that founding narratives are sticky and hard to change. And Tudor shows how leaders like Trump use that stickiness to dog whistle a white nationalism that ranks non-whites as second-class citizens. Mark Gruber criticizes capitalism for creating a depolicized and privatized economy sphere. But even he admits inequality is masked behind the apparent equality of citizens. Race and gender rip the mask off. They make inequality visible. They're not just part of national identity, they shape it. From who gets included to who gets punished for dissent. Now into transnational challenges. Who gets to survive the crisis? Let's talk about climate change and global challenges. Colin Hay questions whether globalization even exists the way we think it does, and says it's less corrosive of state autonomy than expected. Robin Eckersley, meanwhile, names a paradox. Even with more environmental treaties, the most serious and irreversible ecological problems have worsened. So why is global cooperation failing? Because we're not asking who pays the price. Environmental degradation doesn't hit everyone equally. It maps directly onto race and gender, deciding whose air is clean, whose water is poisoned, and whose disasters get ignored. Let's go deeper. Empire and hegemony. IR's original sin? Political scientist David A. Lake points out that the US proclaimed itself an empire that makes its own reality through hierarchy. But that analysis stays at the state level. Jean-Luc Biswas goes further and sharper, asking, why are most human rights violations targeted at Black, brown, and indigenous bodies? That question doesn't just critique empire, it reframes it. Race and gender don't just show up under empire, they're how empire was built. Biswas calls them out as colonial preconceptions that still define who gets to count as fully human in global politics. And finally, let's talk about change. Change, or just power in new packaging. Scholar of global order, Amitav Acharya, admits that even today, change does not solve problems of exclusion or marginalization. And security theorists Ol Waver is even more direct. IR is permeated by relation of power, where a theory from the USA is more likely to gain influence than one in Nigeria. So when the field celebrates pluralism, we have to ask, plural for who? If we don't challenge race and gender hierarchies, we're not changing anything. We're just reshuffling the same old deck. So let's bring it home. All these so-called pillars of IR rest on the same foundation, power. And that power is gendered and racialized by design. Race and gender aren't just topics in IR. They are the field. Without them, IR doesn't explain the world. It excuses it. So, we've looked at war, trade, empire, and more, each reshaped when viewed through race and gender. But here's the twist. These critiques aren't just external challenges to IR, they're supported sometimes accidentally by the field's own core theories. Start with David Lake, who reminds us all IR theories make methodological bets. These bets fail when domestic interests are divided and sovereignty is weak. What divides and defines sovereignty more than race and gender? Post-colonial and feminist scholars show that sovereign states often exclude racialized, gendered, and queer bodies. Race and gender don't undermine Lake's argument, they deepen it. Helen Milner questions the idea of anarchy, warning it may have heuristic disadvantages. In other words, it falsely separates domestic from international politics. But race and patriarchy cross borders. They blur the line entirely, making her critique even sharper through a race/gender lens. Constructivism helps too. K.M. Fierke says IR is built from shared meanings, not hard facts. Norms construct not just actions, but identities. So if IR is shaped by stories, and those stories are told through racialized and gender norms, then race and gender aren't optional. They shape who gets to matter in the system at all. Finally, critical theory. Stephen Roach says its core goal is to expose oppression. What better tool for that than race and gender? They don't just critique power. They uncover how it's built into IR's very foundations. Race and gender aren't add-ons. They help fulfill IR's own theoretical goals by exposing blind spots, unpacking contradictions, and revealing what's been erased. If IR is serious about power, identity, and critique, it has to start here. IR isn't just about treaties and wars. It's about who speaks, who's heard, and who gets erased. Race and gender don't just shape these dynamics. They are the structure. Leaving them out doesn't make IR neutral. It makes it dishonest. Ask different questions, like who's seen as a threat, and the whole map shifts. Bottom line, race and gender aren't side issues. They are international relations to explain or change the world. We start at the margins. That's where power hides and truth begins. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of IRL, International Relations Literally. Next week's big topic, is Barbie a feminist icon or an imperialist in pink? Don't miss it. Until then, stay sharp, stay skeptical, and remember, power is always closer than you think. IRL out.